My name is Lounia Czupper. I'm a partner at Clifford Chance here in Brussels, and I will be the moderator for this conference. So, the main focus of today's conference will be the level 2 measures for the new prospectus regulation. And of course, the timing of this conference is absolutely perfect because ESMA has issued last Thursday 400 pages of consultation. And I'm sure you have all read and understood these 400 pages, or maybe I should say you have all scrutinized the 400 pages to use the correct technical terminology. So, before we dive into the details of these 400 pages, I wanted to take a step back and actually look at the objectives of the PD, the Prospectus Directive, and now the Prospectus Regulation, and make sure that we keep those objectives in our mind when we dive into the details of the consultation. I also wanted to say a few words about my own experience working with the Prospectus Directives 1 and 2 before we start the discussion with the panelists today. So, the Prospectus Directive was introduced more than 10 years ago in 2005, and at the time, when it was introduced, it was a central measure of what was called the EU Financial Services Action Plan. The EU Financial Services Action Plan came about as part of the Lamfalussy process. The objectives of this Financial Services Action Plan were to create this single, integrated market, and that was to be achieved through a series of goals, such as removing barriers to raising capital, ensuring that collateral could be accepted, removing barriers in the form of taxation, and improving transparency and the provision of information. The idea was to have this large integrated market in Europe that could rival the market in the US. Now, 10 years or more than 10 years later, we no longer talk about the EU Financial Services Action Plan, we talk about the CMU, the Capital Markets Union. But is that really different? Let's look at the objectives of the Capital Markets Union and see whether they are not very familiar. The objectives of the CMU are identifying barriers and knocking them down, increasing transparency, increasing access to the capital markets, making it less costly for businesses to raise funds, integrating markets, and increasing investment choices for wholesale, but also for retail. Really, déjà vu, I would say. Why is the Capital Markets Union different from the Financial Services Action Plan? Or let's phrase it differently. Why do we consider that the Financial Services Action Plan in 2005 did not succeed? And why will the Capital Markets Union today succeed? What's different? Well, there is something which is different, and that was actually summarized by Lord Hill, the then commissioner, back in 2015. What he said is, and I'm just going to read out his sentence, over half a century on from the Treaty of Rome, we still don't have a fully functioning single market for capital across the 28 member states. Why should this be different? Because with low growth and high unemployment, the need is greater. And I believe that politicians' will to act is greater. So the circumstances, the environment today is different from what it was when the Financial Services Action Plan was introduced just after the introduction of the euro. The political environment is also different, and the will of the politicians to act is also different. So, looking at the Capital Markets Union, I still see that it talks a lot about difficulties for businesses, and in particular SMEs, and we'll come back to that topic when we in the panel discussion. I see that the CMU action plan still talks about the difficulties for SMEs to attract funding. And according to the paper, 75% of the funding of the SMEs is still funding through loans. And if you compare Europe with the United States, European SMEs still receive 5 times less funding from the capital markets. So let's hope that Lord Hill was right and that the circumstances are indeed different so that the Capital Markets Union can succeed where the Financial Services Action Plan maybe did not succeed as well as it wanted to. Now, diving into the PD itself, the key theme of the Prospectus Directive has always been to try and find a balance between 2 very conflicting aims. On the one hand, enabling the companies to have an easy and cheap access to the capital markets. On the other hand, providing adequate and lots of information to potential investors. PD1 was very much about disclosure of information. Disclose, disclose, disclose. As much as disclosure as possible. And the idea was to give investors information to change the balance, to the asymmetry of information, I think it was called. And the idea was that investors could make the right decision if they had all the information. PD2 said, well, it's great to provide all that information to investors, but it also has to be easily comprehensible, legible, understandable by the investors. So PD2 brought about this idea of summaries. And you had to prepare summaries for almost everything in the retail space, that is. PD3, and it's called still PD3, I think we should say PR1, but I mean, the jargon still talks about PD, Prospectus Directive 3. So PD3 is very much about, well, in addition to disclose and summarize, you now need to select what information you insert in the summary. And I look forward to discussion on that topic to see whether that is going to create difficulties for issuers to make the selection, especially in view of the fact that the liability regime attached to the prospectus has not changed. Now, a final topic I want to briefly touch upon before I hand over to the panelists is the topic of supervisory conversions. It's a topic that is discussed a lot, both in the Prospectus Regulation and in the consultation. But in my practice, as a lawyer drafting prospectuses, I still see a lot of diverging practices among regulators. The competent authorities in one member state will not review a prospectus in the same way. And clearly regulators apply the 3 C's, completeness, comprehensibility, consistency, in a very different way. So will the consultation on supervisory conversions result in a real conversions? Or are the practices of the regulators too much anchored, and will they continue even after the Prospectus Regulation? Now, as well as diverging practices, there is another area which I think results in not supervisory divergence, but diverging practices among themselves, and that is the topic of consumer protection. In some jurisdictions, the scope of the Unfair Contract Terms Directive was expanded to cover financial instruments. Now, that's understandable, but the way that the directive was interpreted in the various jurisdictions and the way that the directive is applied in the various jurisdictions is very, very different across jurisdictions. So consumers are protected in a very different way depending on the jurisdiction in which they are located. And the same actually goes for marketing materials. Marketing materials are subject in some jurisdictions, and of course I'm Belgian, so I will speak a lot about Belgium, but in Belgium there is a very detailed regime about the content of marketing materials, of advertisements or communications to investors, and those advertisements are subject to control by approval by the regulator before they can be used. So again, those diverging rules will result in consumers receiving very different information depending on their jurisdiction. And if the idea is to achieve a common integrated market with supervisory conversions, I'm wondering, and this is very much a question to you, I'm wondering whether those topics of consumer protection should not be part of the thought process as well.